Welcome to the Brew Knowledge Podcast, brought to you by Brewlogix. Education is sometimes regarded as a luxury. However, education usually leads to more opportunity. Our next guests know a thing or two about education, and they're here to help you build a beer education program to improve your staff, drive your sales, and provide your guests with the experience they're looking for. But first, Dan had another great question.
All right, gentlemen, for this episode, I'm coming with another heavy hitter for you guys. And it's on the heels of the interview with the two gentlemen, Dan and Jason with Cicerone. And what I want to do is Jeremy, you are a mature man. I'm going to say this in the nicest way, right? Josh, you're a little
I'm
bit
well
young,
aged.
well aged. um, it literally goes, you got a little gray, I got a little less gray, and then Josh is still solid over here. I don't know if he's dying on the back end or not, but um,
I think he is.
but what I want to talk about is as far as Cicerone and education and really, Jeremy, I want to lean into you from a mature group. They're in the younger generation, they're trying to get into craft beer. I would like to maybe hear your thoughts on some things that you can give, ideas, tips to other peers your age, how they can invite people into the craft beer scene and help them find the love that you found with beer.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we were just discussing this with another guest, or this idea, this concept with another guest. And frankly, I think for me, when we talk about these generations, whatever the generation is, there's always going to be a new generation that is coming of age, that is entering that bar, the brewery, the tap room for the first time, and just experiencing that world, experiencing what inevitably is a third space. And for this young person, these young people, it's just a bar, is just a beer. And I don't know why people lose their minds over the stuff, right? Um, I think there needs to be a good conversation both ways. From at least I'm of a certain age where I remember the 70s. I remember craft breweries opening in the 80s. I remember craft breweries opening in the 90s. I remember the craft beer renaissance and all the waves. It's like I was alive. I wasn't necessarily drinking beer, but I was alive during all of it, and I got to see all of it. And that's why I named my podcast "Good Beer Matters." What I did is because my generation has been there. We've seen it. We know that, yes, that pint of beer in the bar is damn tasty, but there's so much more behind it. It is an absolute doorway to culture, to the world, to better relationships, better experiences, a better understanding of the world around us, even outside of the context of beer. There's so much behind this thing, and that's what my generation needs to share with these younger generations. And vice versa, these younger generations are approaching the world in a completely, vastly different way than we did. We were the ones riding our bikes without helmets and drinking out of a hose and listening to 8-track and cassette tapes, and it was awesome. There's a new, better way of doing things, and I think if we sit down at a table with a beer, younger generations, older generations, and just have a cool conversation, we're going to get a lot done, I think.
Josh, so I want to angle this question in a different way for you. How can the younger generations, and you might be at the top of this, but what can younger generations do to reach out to the older generations, or what are the questions, or how do they get involved with folks of the like of Jeremy Storton?
Yeah, I think one of the best things about beer is it knows no bounds. It doesn't matter what generation you come from. It doesn't matter how old you are. as long as you're of age to be consuming it, or around people who allow you to consume it. But nonetheless, it brings people from different backgrounds with different preferences together and can start that conversation. So I think if you're looking to learn more about the industry, the craft, the liquid inside your glass when it comes to beer, just being approachable and being willing to go out and ask the question, hey, whether you're at a brewery for the first time, can you tell me a little bit about this beer? Find somebody who is passionate about it. We've got a great group of folks right here that I think would be more than happy to hear from anybody. There's a whole lot of other folks that are doing the same thing. So not being, I don't want to say afraid, but not being timid to reach out and say, hey, I want to learn more about this. I'm interested about this. Why are you, as somebody who's so passionate about this, what sparks your passion? And just see if that sparks passion for you. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the challenge is going to be, we can't force our passions onto others, right? I think there's parallel industries, fishing with a hand line for some people is really exciting. Fishing with a huge offshore rig on $1 million boat is exciting for other people. And
Or
so I think the thing with
spearfishing, completely different thing.
or
That's
spearfishing,
where I go.
absolutely. And so I think the thing is, beer can be parallel to fishing in that regard. At the end of the day, if you're really intrigued and excited about American light lager or beer that is readily available, then yeah, go enjoy that passion. If you're excited about pushing your taste profiles, pushing your boundaries of what you think you like or you think your preferences are, going out and exploring and finding folks who can help guide you through that process, I think is a great way to kind of learn more and to put yourself out there. And you never know, you might end up being the next person who's educating the generation that comes after you and having the same question asked.
I think to take away here, the craft beer industry is in a great position with the older generation really holding the flame and the torch, and the younger generation. I just challenge them to be curious and don't be timid. To Josh's point, to go ask questions. And I think to Josh's point again is reach out to Josh Lindsay, reach out to Jeremy Storton, reach out to these people that have been in the industry, because I promise you, you'll get an answer back. So, gentlemen, thank you for the question and the answer, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
Cheers.
The Brewlogix craft beverage community drives on-premise profitability through our unified technology platforms. Go to brewlogix.com to get started.
And now, our interview with Master Cicerones and co-owners of the Cicerone program, Dan Imdieke and Jason Pratt. Welcome back to the Brew Knowledge Podcast, everyone. This one is going to be super awesome because, as you know, I'm a Cicerone. Our buddy Josh is a Cicerone. Dan is in the Cicerone process as well. But we're talking to a couple master Cicerones who now run the Cicerone program. We're going to say Cicerone many, many, many times during the course of this interview. Ad-free, of course. But first off, let's start with my guest, Dan Imdieke. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yep, a lot
Perfect.
of vowels
Nailed
in
it.
there. Yep.
First try. I know. Yes, the M and the D and the K are silent, right? So you're a master Cicerone. You're now one of the co-owners, presidents, CEOs, however you guys break it down, of Cicerone. But you really got your background running bar operations and training for the Yard House chain. You were a corporate beer buyer for Old Chicago Pizza, and you worked with the Molson Coors education team with Jason here as well, and that really kind of led you there. Let me introduce Jason real quick, then I'd love for you guys to kind of fill in the gaps and give us your background in beer. But Jason, kind of like a same thing with Dan. You're running Cicerone now. You're also a master Cicerone. You're a fermentation scientist for Molson Coors, and started working in the beer education program with Dan. And then and at some point you ended up the director of beverage innovation for North America. I don't know the details of that, but it sounded like
Ooh, yeah.
right. It sounded
So
really,
fancy.
it
Real
sounded so
fancy.
fancy. I had to include that.
Right.
You guys, thank you for being here. Please fill in the gaps of who you are in your background.
Sure. So, just like you said, I started in the on-premise in restaurants, and in the early life of that Yard House concept, and that's really where I fell in love with beer. Was doing a lot of operations and training for them, kind of in the early life of that company. And so we were really starting from scratch, and probably got to wade into some waters at a young age that I maybe wouldn't have normally, and kind of opened the 20 of the first 25 of their restaurants. And so that's where it started. Just loved teaching about beer, loved getting people excited over the bar, doing that when I was there. And then, yeah, kind of went from there to the beer buying side and into education. So kind of like roots are in the on-premise and some of the taproom stuff that we've talked about, and have seen firsthand what training and education means through some of that. And then Molson Coors was where it kind of went to another level. It was a best-in-class education program. That's where I met Jason and so many other great people, and then embarked on that kind of like final level Master Cicerone journey. And luckily, didn't have to do it alone. And so, yeah, now we're doing this, and couldn't be more thrilled to kind of take Cicerone to the next chapter, and feel all the weight and responsibility of that, but excited to do it.
Yeah, so I don't know. It was a fun kind of journey for me, and I think you hear everybody got into it through homebrewing and all these things. Like for me, it was a little bit different because mine was through kind of the science side of things, and my choice coming out of grad school was beer or vegetables. Right, not a tough choice when you kind of look at it from that level. Beer sounds way cooler, but there was a little brewing company in Milwaukee that had a job opening for a research microbiologist, decent fermentation scientist at the time, and I thought, you know what, there's that's a pretty cool way to kind of apply the craft and go check that out. Didn't know as much about beer at the time, and then got through my interview, and one of the guys that had been working there for 35 years kind of took me. He's like, "You want to go see the brewery?" Sure, right? Day long process going through these interviews. I was drained. He takes me through under and over past these tanks and kind of pours this beer for me and says, like, "This is the freshest, Miller Lite you're ever going to taste." Right? It's this whole thing. But it was such a foundational beer. It was such a interesting thing seeing the look on his face, right, as he said it. And he believed in his heart that this was the best beer that was ever brewed, right? That was his. And I was like, I want to be as passionate as he is about anything, right? Like this is cool, and made me fall in love with it and made me want to learn more about it. So got into the education side of it and was teaching new employees through that, and then took a role that was officially in education at that point. But I was always that person that was going, hey, you know what we should do? Hey, you know what we should do? And didn't have an outlet for it. So a role opened up. This was after this point. I was a master cicerone, which gave me some flexibility, and I think people were a little bit more willing to listen to my stupid ideas. So I made the jump over into the marketing side of things. So jumped into marketing, kind of faked it till I made it over there, and then got into kind of innovation because that was where the ideas were kind of coming to life. And that was the thing that I was really passionate about. So got a chance to work through a number of brands, launch some really cool stuff. And then kind of worked into that director of innovation role, kind of on that front. So it was a crazy path, one that I wouldn't say is easy to follow, but at the same time, you look back at what beer knowledge, and I think it really is kind of a testament to what beer knowledge can do for you and the leeway that it gives you as you're kind of carving a path. Because honestly, the last couple jobs that I've had didn't exist prior to me getting there, and they kind of built them for me and things like that. And that was one of the things I kind of look back on fondly with what Master Cicerone did for my career, and I ended up here with Dan. So yeah, it's been a fun journey, but happy to be here.
The long and winding road of beer greatness. I love
That's
it.
right. Oh, yeah, I don't know about greatness, but we're doing okay.
Well, it is beer, so therefore.
I was just saying that is great. So.
Well, I think in that vein, like there's decades of knowledge between the five of us that are here, and the industry has gone through challenges from the beginning of time when beer was first being brought to market. We're entering what's been called a mature market today. What challenges do you all see in the beverage industry?
Yeah, I mean, folks like you are connected to the beer industry know that there's some headwinds, and there's some share, and there's some competition for fewer dollars, right? But beer's not going anywhere. I think that's the thing to remember. It's still a large category. It's been around this long. There's still plenty of passionate beer fans out there. But I would argue, from an education standpoint, even though money might be tight for some folks, to me, education is one of those things that is even more important now. Instead of the first thing to go when times get tough, I feel like now more than ever, the way you differentiate your brands, the way your people talk about them and romance them and get people excited about them, the taproom experience that people have, in your brewery or in your restaurant, wherever it might be. I think now today it's even more important to separate that than it ever has been, because we know that we're competing with wine and spirits, and the reality is competing with quite a number of competent breweries that are out there making wonderful beer. So
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who was asked to step away from their education role as times got tough, I totally understand that. And I think, I've said very similar. Education plays such a role in igniting passion. I think that's a key thing that we need to keep bringing to the light and keep bringing to the forefront when it comes to beer. Is we're all extremely passionate. There's a whole group, a whole generation behind us that equally has opportunity to have just as much passion if they're able to get some of the knowledge and have that spark of interest ignite into something that becomes so much greater. And I think we've all had that spark. In some cases, it's become much more than a spark. It's a true lifelong dedication. But yeah, I just want to echo that, because yeah, I agree. I think education needs to be at the forefront, and the companies and the industries that are putting that at the forefront are continuing to see success even through headwinds and maturing markets and challenges.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think it also kind of knocks down that barrier for entry, right? You think about some of those consumers that are coming into the category that are, turning 21 and trying to figure out what they want to drink. And you see a sea of beer, cans, bottles, everything, pretty labels all over the shelf. And it's intimidating, I think, for a lot of folks. And you hear that a lot from consumer research, is that I don't even know where to start. I've heard of a couple things. I might have heard of IPAs and things because I know those are popular and I might try those, but I don't know what a good one is or what a bad one is. So if you're going to spend your hard-earned dollars on something, you want it to be a memorable experience and something you like. And I think education really helps to make kind of that crazy beer shelf. It breaks it down a little bit for people. It makes it a little bit more approachable and kind of gives them the confidence that they need to go and shop confidently, right? And share, right? And sparks that passion again, because it really is impossible to be passionate about something you don't know anything about, right? So that's a really key part of that too, I think.
I want to ask both of you guys this question, but I want you guys to lean into your background. So Dan, with yours in the on premise, and Jason with yours and really working for a big brand, and I would assume you spent some time in wholesaler education as well.
Mhm.
If I Okay, so
Yeah.
coming from those angles, Dan, I'll ask you first, then you can answer Jason. What is the value, or how did you kind of look at the ROI for educating your staff on craft beers, craft beverages? For as you guys leaning into education is more important now than ever. How can a craft beer program, whether it is a brewery or even just a craft, a restaurant or bar that offers craft, what is the ROIs you look at there? Or what are some identifiers that you say now this is making more sense for me to either get an educator in here or pay for an education program like Cicerone, things like that?
I mean, it's a great question, because I think there's times and metrics sometimes that are directly related to that, and you can measure it pretty readily. And there's times when it's just kind of an amalgamation of a number of things that's tough to measure. And I think that's one of the reasons, you have education firm, solid believers, and some that are kind of like, well, I don't know that we need that, right? And so I can tell you just from experience, having done beer training for an up and coming brand in Yard House, and then doing it again for an established brand with 100 locations. Um, I think we saw, in the old Chicago days, we rolled out a complete beer video training program. We had a level 1 Cicerone for a ton of employees, and we saw a shift just in overall beer sales from something like -2 to +3. So you're talking about a 5-point shift in beer sales. Now, we had a lot of things going on, different marketing programs, tap takeovers, a lot of new programming that all, when you put it all together, could be seen as responsible for that. But I think it's hard to deny that if people are coming in and having the best beer experience possible and understanding what they're drinking, getting excited about it, I think we always used to say, imagine if each of your bartenders, beer tenders, could sell one or two more beers a shift, times that by the number of bartenders, and multiply that by days in a year. I mean, you're talking about a huge lift, and that's not a big ask. And the reality
Right.
is, are you going to always know when those moments come as an operator? No. But I think the idea that someone is going to hang around and have another beer because they are stoked on what their experience they're having, their interaction with the bartender, that they can bring your beers to life, that is not a far-fetched idea. And so to me, I think it's it bleeds into your whole culture of how your team and your people talk about beer. Beer education can be formal. It can be Cicerone certification. It can be, having an educator on staff. It can also be trying 2 beers in a pre-shift with some of your bartenders and servers, and just creating a culture of how we talk about them. You have 6 different IPAs on draft. What's the difference between them? Can they articulate that? Can they get just a quick sample before their shift so they know going in how to talk to a guest about it? I mean, education can take a lot of different forms, not all of which have to be super cost prohibitive. So I'm going
Totally.
on and on, but I'm pretty passionate because I think that you've seen the return to me is not always exactly measurable, but if you're playing the long game in the beer industry, which I think should be the focus as people weather a bit of these headwinds, beer education, talking about beer in a passionate way and in a competent way, is never going to go out of style. It's just not. And so you're seeing breweries that do that well rising, and those that kind of have an average taproom experience struggling, even if they're making great beer. We're at a time where you have to check all the boxes: marketing, branding, taproom events, beer's got to be good. All those things have to come to life. It's not good enough just to show up like maybe it was in the mid 2000s ago. I have a brewery, and there's a line out the door. It's just different now. So anyway, that's my long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think to add to that too, Jeremy, I know you've got a question coming up here, but we're talking to 2 of 28 master cicerones in the world. I think we're approaching close to 200 advanced cicerones in the world. But when we think about 10,000 brands in the United States and 20,000 globally, not everybody has access to somebody who's achieved that level or who has dedicated themselves to go and get that level. So what advice would you give to folks or organizations who maybe don't have somebody on staff who is gone to that level, but how would they get started, or how would you recommend kind of building the basic stepstones of getting those education programs out there?
Yeah, I think
Jason,
there's a couple. Yeah, I was gonna say I can jump in. I think there's a couple different things that that people can do when it comes to that, but you don't have to be at that advanced or master level. We always talk about your beer education as a journey, right? And as long as people are progressing, I think that's the important thing about that. But sometimes the best education can come from the people that are just the most passionate about it, right? And as they're learning, they're bringing people along for the ride, because that's contagious, right? Like that sort of education or that passion for it is contagious. So I think the best way to get started is just to kind of take that first step. Put something in place. And as Dan mentioned, it can be a super informal thing. But I've always found that experiential training tends to work the best for people, especially early on. So getting a chance for people to, sample the ingredients and just understand where some of those flavors are coming from. Or like Dan mentioned, you've got, 4 or 5 IPAs. Let's put them side by side. And here's how I would sell each of these things. Here's how here's how they're different from each other. Here's the things that they're similar to. So if you know that somebody comes in and they like, beer X, this is the one that we would recommend for them because it's a similar profile. It's got similar aromatics, and this is what we want to do with it, right? So I think giving people those high level tools that they can have, elevator pitch kind of tools that they can go in and confidently speak those things into existence, I think is it goes such a long way for people. Adds to the engagement that those employees feel, right? They kind of feel a little bit more a part of it, and they don't kind of fear the conversations that they're going to have with their customers as they walk up to the table, because they don't feel like they have the tools they need to do their job, right? So I think just taking that first step, starting out with experiential training, and then you can work into programs and kind of certifications and things like that as it goes. But it's it's really about just creating those experiences for people.
What
Go
I
for it.
want to touch one thing on your wholesaler back or working for MC. When you and this goes a little bit into innovation too, like when you bring a new product to market and it might be new. I mean, you go back the seltzer thing. Like, I don't know if any of those innovations were yours, right? But you don't have to talk about that one topic,
Oh yeah,
right? But
oh yeah.
um, but when you're bringing something new to market, from a bigger brand, like and you're one person and you have to get out to all of these outlets, like what is kind of a strategy? Like, I think Dan, you mentioned romance. I know Josh talks a lot about romance as well,
He's a
describing products. Like
romantic guy.
he very romantic. But like, what are some of the strategies? Like, keep it simple, keep it short. Like, Jason, what do you go to market with? Like when you try to introduce new things?
Yeah, I think what we had to do, especially like, coming in like a lot of the seltzers, I was heavily involved with early on and stuff. So you're leaning into the consumer research that kind of tells you what people are looking for. So I think that's story number one, right? Like, is that you kind of start with those things to start building your story. But the other piece of it that you really want to do is let the distributors know specifically as you're talking to them how your product, whether that's beer or seltzer, whatever that is, fits into their portfolio and why they should kind of focus on it versus the other things that are there, right? Because the interesting thing about that is that the Miller Coors network, Molson Coors network, had the majority of the seltzer game locked up as it was, right? So you're adding another thing, and they've got White Claw and they've got Truly already. So they don't necessarily need this thing. So how are you differentiating it from the products that they already have? And what incentive do they have then to focus on your product instead of those? Where does it fit alongside of those things? And I think, side-by-side tastings go a long way with that, making sure that your products have a differentiation point that's, kind of different and consumer relevant, right? It can't just be different for the sake of being different. But what the insights are as to why you're building those things, I think also matters. And then making sure that you've got something that kind of breaks out on shelf. And that's something that I, coming from my technical side of things and loving beer and all of that stuff, it's like, oh, you could, if you brew it, they will come sort of idea, right? I, kind of had to eat some humble pie on the marketing, the impact of marketing, kind of the influence that it has on that stuff. And I learned a ton from some brilliant marketers when it came to that. But, breakthrough at shelf is such a huge thing because we talked about that sea of beers, bottles, cans, whatever. A lot of them look pretty. How do you look at the category that exists out there that kind of a lot of the seltzers kind of fall on the same color pattern and stuff like that? What are you going to do to break out from that sea of sameness that's there from a product standpoint as well as from a packaging standpoint, how your product comes to life? So all of those things factored in to those elements.
I love it, and I don't mean to jump in the seltzer thing. Like, you
Oh,
can
no.
use all those things you just said in the beer, but it was like
Also applies
it
to
was
beer, yeah.
Are
yeah,
we even
that was
allowed to
like
say seltzer on this podcast?
The Seltzer Knowledge Podcast. You're gonna have to rebrand the whole thing. So yeah,
Yeah.
Well, and I think the interesting too is like when we think about
We'll
what
just
is
bleep it
coming to
out.
market, it isn't just beer, it isn't just seltzer, it's wine on tap, it's cocktails, it's tepache,
Yeah.
it's new beverage, what we'll call new beverage innovation in the US, but taking inspiration from worldwide. So I think there's a lot of things, whether it be new styles in beer like cold IPA, new complete malt based products, spirit based products. So yeah, I think to Dan's point, it's like you can take that insight and kind of apply it to anything new that you're bringing to a program, and then be able to use these insights to kind of get your team excited and ultimately get your consumers excited.
absolutely.
It just real quick to jump in. I mean, all those things Jason talked about gets those wholesalers' attention. I can't tell you the number of times we've done side by side tasting and just like kind of the people going through that process because people aren't opening 4 IPAs and putting them side by side and going, what's the difference in bitterness? Do you see what these strata hops taste like versus that? Like, people don't do that. And so a lot of times, even wholesaler sales folks, they don't necessarily, they can't necessarily articulate why they like something or don't like something. And so just to walk them through some of that experiential process, a light bulb kind of goes on, and then they're using all the things Jason talked about to sell, and then they're using like that authentic, like, hey, I drink this and it's delicious kind of vibe as well. If you can combine those two, I mean, that's a pretty dangerous sales tool, right?
I was thinking about that too. I mean, the question I had, you guys already touched on, and it's pretty well covered. But the thing that I kept thinking about is, we're all talking about data. We're all talking about, well, if we're trying to sell in a beer as a sales or distributor or something else or an idea, it's like, well, here are the numbers to support that this is a good financial idea. It's like going to the doctor's office. They're going to take your blood pressure, check your respirations, check your pulse. That's all empirical data. And then that doctor's going to look at you and say, where does it hurt? Tell me, how's it hurt? On a pain scale of 1 to 10, and that's all anecdotal, right? That's
yeah.
all, what I'm telling you. That's nothing you can measure. And both of those are equally important. We need to know the margins on this keg and how the sell through and all that sort of stuff. But then we get into Josh's romance. Tell me about this beer. How is this beer gonna float my boat for the next week and a half while we have it? And so, if you guys will, from your experience, how do you skirt the difference between, yes, here's what you need to know, and here's what you really, really need to know when you're trying to discuss beer sales or taproom operation?
Go
Jason, you
ahead.
want to go first?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, for me, I think it's really about knowing your audience with a lot of these things, because I think there are going to be times where that romance language is appreciated, right? And you can dive in and you can have the nerdiest of nerdy conversations with somebody, and that's awesome, right? Like everybody loves those geek out moments and stuff. I think as passionate as beer people as we are, we all have been in that point where you kind of calm yourself down a little bit and go, okay, let's pump the brakes. But I
You see
think
their eyes roll in the back of their head. It's
yeah,
like,
I was
and I'm
gonna
done.
say, yeah, I lost them. Yep, there it goes. But I think, yeah, it's really know your audience, because there are times when that stuff is appropriate and you're really romancing something and diving deep into it, and that's great. I think there are other times when that elevator pitch, like here are the three things that you need to know about this, are the ones that are going to get retained most, right? So it's really about building a story that's going to be relevant to your customer, your consumer, whoever is on the other side, whoever is receiving that message for you. And I think that applies for salespeople, that applies for beer tenders, bartenders, whatever. Like, I mean, whether you're selling it to wholesalers as a brewery, that story remains relevant, because you should know kind of what that customer is looking for, have a good feel for that, and then don't be afraid to push them kind of one step past that every once in a while, right? And maybe you can build into those like deeper stories and really help them understand the importance of why this romance copy and why this romance kind of story about this brand is going to resonate with people too, because people love stories at the end of the day. You know, when you
Yeah.
think about the best story, or the best sales kind of approach, a lot of times it's telling a story, getting people engaged with that, and then kind of making them kind of see it from an angle that you want to see that. It'll open their eyes as they go and taste your beer, and they're going to look at it through different eyes as a result of that, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's a big piece of that. Dan,
And
I don't know
Dan,
if you have
Well, I
thoughts
think
before
on.
to add on
and
to
Dan,
that too. Oh, go ahead.
sorry, Dan, before you answer, I want to slip in real quick too. And and I agree with all that, especially if you're talking to a consumer. And this is where the idea of Cicerone and education comes in. It's like you should know more than your average customer, your average consumer. Um, and because it does take education, it does take experience to have those stories, to have that knowledge, to have that experience, to romanticize like, oh man, this beer is going to, you know,
Knock your
float your
socks
boat.
off.
Yeah, knock your socks off. Dan, what's your response to that? What do you make of that whole
I,
notion?
I mean, I think so. Just got back from actually doing an event with the Yard House folks, and one of the things we talked about was the practical application of some of this stuff. So I think it's got to be practical, to kind of like what Jason said, is knowing who, what is, at a bar at a Yard House, for an example, what does that guest want you to be? Do they want you to be a beer nerd? Do they want to just give you a quick understanding of why IPA X tastes different than IPA Y, and then sell me on why I would like it, right? And
Yeah,
then the other piece is kind of going into what you said, Jeremy, is there are pieces of knowledge, even within Cicerone, that are, you're going to have a conversation about less often. And an example we used in this event was, Yard House nationally has Chimay Blue Label and Schneider Weiss Aventinus are two of their beers they have on draft, right? And you don't see those everywhere,
no,
especially on a scale like a concept with the number of locations Yard House has. And so what we talked about is when the time comes to have that conversation with the guest about those beers, can you, right? It's like, can you do these beers justice? Because you've got these iconic beers sitting behind you, and they're just going to collect dust if you don't know how to sell them or talk about them when the time does come. So I think one of the things people have asked about Cicerone is like, okay, there's great. You're quizzing me on Doppelbock and Wee Heavy and all these different things. True, there are some, IPA conversations probably going to happen more often, but depending on whatever scenario you're in, your brewery makes a specialty beer or a one-off style or a traditional example of a style. Can you do that justice when the time comes? And so that foundation needs to be there, I think. And otherwise, we talked about how special it is to have a Trappist beer on draft that you just don't see everywhere. And I think it just, some light bulbs went on when we said that, of like, okay, now I don't know that I always knew how to sell this, but now I can get someone excited about it with just small practical talking points at the right
So to lean into that, I think I don't remember which one you guys were talking about this earlier, but the knowledge of the older generation in craft beer is there, and the jump, I think, for the newcomers is looks to be very large. When you do have a classic beer like that on tap, how do you move the needle for that? I'm gonna call Gen Z as just that generation, but how do you move the needle for Gen Z to get excited about that product and say, hey, like, you may not, I don't know, you may not like it the first go around, but that's a very, to your point, a very cool offering that you guys are throwing on draft here. What are some insights?
I mean, you just say, hey, you want to try beer made by monks at a monastery that goes back to medieval times? Like you just, I mean, just
Yes. That's the
small,
only appropriate answer.
Yeah.
small little tidbits. Then you throw in that it's, 9.5% ABV. Oh, you got my attention now. And you just kind of walk through it. And if you know a little bit about Belgium and Belgian brewing culture, I think there's just a way to bring those to life. And again, it doesn't need to be a drawn out story about the history of the Cistercian order. It just needs to be like an idea of like, hey, this is one of those cool traditions in brewing that not everyone knows, and I can give you that experience here. Would you like to try it? I think there's some differing tastes with Gen Z and lower alcohol, healthier, those kinds of things. But they also like stories and authenticity. And so I think there's a way to maybe weave some of that in.
Well, in that vein, we've
TikTok
talked
too.
a lot about product types. We've talked about brands. We've talked about some different levels of education. But when you look at the Cicerone program and the offerings that it has, from certifications to extending your education through Road to Cicerone programs and some other programs that the Cicerone program has launched, and some rumblings I've heard of to be launched, how does the Cicerone program help with all of this? If I'm a listener today and I'm remotely aware of the Cicerone program, but I'm not totally sure exactly what they do, how does the program itself relate all the way back to these educational opportunities that we've discussed today?
Yeah, I think the thing that excited Dan and I about kind of getting into the seats that we're in now is that, I don't know, I think about my journey to kind of get here. And I started off as somebody, like I mentioned, that didn't know a ton about beer, but was really excited about it and worked my way through. But the thing I found is that the journey itself and the fun that I had kind of learning about different things and the way that it opened my eyes, right? Kind of the structured, kind of format of the program, having topics that force you out of the things that are immediately interesting to you. For me, it was, the technical side kind of came the easiest because I'm coming from a science background and things like that. So that's kind of how I got my gateway in. But then opening up my eyes to styles and some of the draft and service stuff was things that I just didn't have any exposure to, but really grew to appreciate and fall in love with, right? So I think that it can be that gateway for people, just having a structured format that allows you to kind of work through a process and work towards something too. Because it's kind of fun to be able to say that you're working towards being a beer expert, right? And I know expert is always one of those terms that people kind of either look at one of two different ways, right? Because it's a great power comes great responsibility, but you're somebody that has taken the time to advance your beer knowledge to a point and be certified in it, right? And we always have looked at Cicerone as the gold standard for beer education when it comes to the beer industry, right? I think Ray did an amazing job of building the program to that spot. And we see it as our job to make sure we're kind of upholding that and then advancing it and pushing it and making it relevant, keeping it relevant for people as they come into beer, as they turn 21 or as they kind of find it along their own journeys, right? So I think that's at least part of it. And Dan, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Well, I think we've come in trying to make sure that it's as relevant as possible. I mean, it hasn't been quite announced yet, but we do have some syllabus updates coming sooner than later, where we've included some of the things that are on trend for the beer market, some elements of the brewing process at level one, some things like that. We took a step back and said, if I was considering Cicerone, what would I think a certified beer server program should entail? Is there anything missing? And so I think we're assessing that across the board. And what are some other practical kind of things like that we can activate? I mean, while we were in the middle of the conversation around acquiring Cicerone, there was a selling with Cicerone module that launched, which is aimed at brewery and distributor sales folks that talks about some of the things we're talking about today, which is like, how do you become that trusted advisor for the beer category, where you're giving an on-premise account advice on everything from draft system and draft quality to product mix to they saw this obscure style and they know they can go to you and ask you questions about it. How do you leverage that into a better business relationship as well as personal relationships? So I think we're looking at more products like that, as well as some things like Jason mentioned to meet some of the consumers that are out there. Because I know a lot of friends of mine have said, I just want to beer better at home. How do I beer better at home? And I think there's no reason Cicerone can't be the voice of that, of kind of what Jason was talking about at the beginning. Like going into that beer aisle, what do I do? How do I make sure the beer I'm getting and bringing home is fresh? What glasses do I need? And then when I go to taste it, how do I get the most out of this beer, or at least more than I got before I took a course on it. So I think there's all those things we're trying to have apply where it's, getting consumers to continue to be excited about beer is important for us, and is a world Cicerone hasn't really waded into in the past. And then making sure from an industry standpoint, which has always been the focus and bread and butter of Cicerone, that it's as relevant as it can be.
I'm excited with everything you guys just said. Where this thing's going.
Yeah.
That was a question of mine of what's next, but yeah, you guys kind of opened the door a little bit and gave us a peek. So
I don't know.
I'm sure you
My
guys
wheels
have a
are
lot of
turning. How
hard
about
work.
you, Josh?
Well, you guys, we're going to need some help. So
Yeah, I was going to say.
What I loved about, you guys have mentioned this a couple of times, but is the experience. And Cicerone provides I think the ability, the education to know and to nail down how either a professional can provide that experience for a consumer, or to your latest, talking about going through the beer aisle, like how should I experience this at home and things like that. So it's an experiential economy nowadays, and yeah, you guys seem like your ships are pointed in the right direction.
Yeah,
we're trying.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to choose, right? There's this kind of wide playing field with Cicerone, where we're never going to get away from the kind of the North Star of gold standard beer certification. But I think it's kind of choosing what are the most impactful things right now, and that's what we've had a lot of conversations between Jason and I, and then internally with the team. What are we going to go do sooner than later, and what's an evolution maybe after that? And I think there's no one right answer, and that's part of the fun, but part of the anxiety too.
Yeah. But
Well, as
it's
participants
also
of the program, advocates of the program, fans of the program, it makes me excited to hear the energy that's coming, what you all are bringing to the table. I think the program has continued to elevate, and I think anybody listening to this, if you've been on the fence about joining the program or taking that first step into it, definitely look at the syllabus, keep an eye out for these updates. And I think there's, to the points that have been made earlier, like there's experience in just going through that and having that guided structure to learn more. And then if you decide you want to take it to the next level through the examination, hats off to you. But I think that journey, that evolution will ultimately help rise this industry and continue to kind of fix a lot of the woes that a lot of people are talking about. So hats off to y'all for your dedication and your commitment and moving this thing forward.
It's awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And final thing and this is going to sound silly, but for anyone who's like Cicerone, where can I find that? What's the website? How can they connect with the program?
Yeah, so www.cicerone.org. Come see us over there. All the social channels, you should be able to find us. Cicerone certification program out there. We're out there. We're posting things, educational content. Kind of new look and feel on the social channels as well. Trying to make sure that we're speaking with a different voice, I think, and trying to inject some of the personality. Because again, this is beer, right? This is fun. This is about people. So you're going to see a lot more of that from us. Keeping the education there, but making sure that we're involving the community and making sure that we're showcasing the great people that are doing amazing work, kind of with their certification. So, come find us.
Awesome. I appreciate you guys being here. Thank you for the time.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah.
The advice on this show is obviously not a one-size-fits-all solution. The goal is to provide ideas that will either work for you or stimulate other ideas on how you can improve your business. We hope these conversations were helpful, but let us know what works well for you. Until next time, cheers.